I'm doing this part 5 as clarifications and one correction, sort of mini correction. I look back at the Vighi essays, and it's worse even. It's worse. The bogus thing is worse, which is that he says the quantitative easing and the other Fed programs from there was an array of Fed programs. He doesn't discuss them or you seem to know what they are, but all the stimulus and the quantitative easing and the new money printing comes under the category of new money printing, sort of led by the mythos of MMT, although they're not officially following that policy, but the propaganda was reassuring the public that the government can make value out of its ass, which is not true. Anyway, I'll discuss that on another one. I did discuss that before. Anyway, so Vighi says the economy was put into a therapeutic coma, which is apparently something he picked up from, wonky magazines, Wall Street commentators, and he didn't invent this nonsense, but it is nonsense, and it's an image that has no real reference. But he says this was done to prevent hyperinflation. He doesn't say just to guard against inflation, which is the sort of mandate of the Federal Reserve Bank. And of course, that's the single duty of the European Central Bank with the euro is to prevent inflation or keep it within a certain limit. And, that's the job of the Federal Reserve Chairman. But he says hyperinflation. And it's important that this is putting you in an infantile state. It worked on me because I gave him, I said, well, he used that word because, he used that word erroneously, but I'm going to pretend, I'm going to understand what he's saying. He's saying it was an effort to tamp down inflationary pressures, but that's not what he said. He said hyperinflation, and that's really important because hyperinflation means something, and it doesn't just mean a lot of inflation. It doesn't mean high inflation. It doesn't mean what we're seeing, even 20% or even 100% inflation. Hyperinflation is the worthlessness of the currency. The wheelbarrows of Reichsmarks that you see in the Great Depression in Germany, you could wipe your ass with it. The end of the movie Rollover has people lighting with Jane Fonda and Chris Christopherson, interesting movie, has people lighting their cigars with $100 bills or whatever. This is worthless. It's worth less than the paper it's printed on. And the only cause of hyperinflation is political. Like the main cause of hyperinflation is revolution, is that everyone in the country, or most people, including the ruling class, believe that the government and the class that it represents is going to be overthrown by the people, or it's been created, the same kind of devastation is created by imperial aggression and destruction. So, a government and a class is going to be overthrown, going to be destroyed. Its currency is no good, becomes no good. Not that it's worth less, not that its market mechanisms are adjusting its value, but that it loses use value. And the distinctions, the specificity of value of Marx's explanation of value, you can't just throw that away and continue to understand, commodities and value and money. It is like it has to be use value. It has to be good. There's a reason that a counterfeit bill could sometimes, if you had a lot of good counterfeits, you could actually deplete the value of the real currency. But once it was discovered, the counterfeits are worth nothing. That's because they don't have the use value, not because when you were fooled by them, they weren't equal and equivalent to all the others. So, okay, so that was one thing I wanted to emphasize, that Vighi's notion that hyperinflation was being threatened is absurd, and the whole point is to confuse you, to get rid of the idea of hyperinflation, to wipe it from the map. Even though, of course, it's very possible that the ruling class means to. That's one of the things that it could do in order to blow up their money. They might go through a an induced hyperinflation. If a government defaults, if its debt is no good, that's what happens. Okay, or if they, the czar, or okay, Bitcoin, it demonstrated it. It's going to be it's going to suffer hyperinflation. It's going to maybe go to nothing, be worthless, and be abolished. Okay, so and that's put before you as an exercise. This political, like running gerbils through a maze. Okay, so the other things I wanted to clarify a couple of things. QE, now I've forgotten. Anyway, the big clarification is, what is the purpose of Vighi's masculinization, his fake? The purpose is to displace the truth. And the purpose of the reason that you want to displace the truth is actionable. The truth has a power of its own. It can organize people, and it can motivate people, and it can assist you in political accomplishments. This is the oldest debate in Marxism. What's the role, for example, of the intellectuals in the revolution? When I was growing up, the book everyone read was the Sartre book, The Question of Method or Problem of Method, or whatever it was called. The whole thing, contemplating the question of, how intellectuals, how are they necessary? How do they contribute? Of course, the revival of Gramsci was largely about that problem. Spent a lot of time studying what intellectuals can contribute, meaning, and that was the political description of that debate. What is the role of the intellectuals in the revolution? And in the 19th century, this was a question of what is the role of the petty bourgeoisie, because there were almost no working class intellectuals, and it wouldn't be a question of what their role would be. That would be obvious, but it's like, how can the petty bourgeoisie, or even the aristocracy or the capitalists, how can Engels, Marx, what's his name discussed this, Kautsky a lot, Liebknecht, Luxembourg, how do they contribute? What do they give to the revolution? And what is in what way are they necessary? What's their duty? And then in academia, after the death of Sartre, really, so in the 80s, when you got postmodernization, an interesting thing happened is that became translated into a more abstract and polite debate called theory and practice. And so the intellectuals are replaced by theory, and so it became a mind-body. They returned it to as medieval dualism, a kind of, which is exactly what it was, and it was a political debate about, what it meant to become an ally, like what your job was if you were educated and a communist and breveted, maybe. How would you contribute to the revolution? And then, of course, Mao, created a whole new spectrum of ideas about this and programs. And anyway, then it became, in the so-called Western Marxism, which is another made-up thing, theory and practice. Anyway, so but we know what we conclude from that is, about the importance of the correct analysis, and who is in a position to supply it, but what your duties are, what your responsibilities are, because it's a really important tool for any kind of actualization of the powers of the masses to free themselves. And then increasingly, especially in the wired billion, which is now spreading out to almost wired 2 billion, the mass media, the social media is such an important tool of disruption and disarray. And one of the most devastating things that the ruling class has learned to do really well is create fakes and distractions to divide people and to stupidify and to displace, to make it impossible for the theory that is produced by the communist intellectuals to serve its function. And so that's Vighi's cuckoo. But that means it has to look a lot like the truth. It has to look a lot like our analysis, and we see that that's true, but it transforms it. So the major transformation, of course, the truth is, what the truth is the ruling class learned through the 90s, through its whole period of financialization, through the mid-80s after they, took a very aggressive, there was a very aggressive program to financialize, to create the global financial system, and it starts in the 70s, of course, getting off the gold standard. But this was a bloody battle. I mean, there are famous fallen resistors within the bourgeoisie and, in social democracy and even Christian democracy. Aldo Moro, Olaf Palme. This is the France did not come on board until quite late, and so the creation of that, during that process of creating global financialization, the ruling class learned a lot, and they did have a little bit of a sorcerer's apprentice. There were things that emerged that they obviously were not prepared for, but they learned how to master things. Nothing was treated as weather, and they learned to create they learned like how they could benefit from certain kinds of crises, and then they learned to create those crises. And it's as simple as, learning what created the so-called flight to safety. So when they want, something would happen, some disruption, a political disruption, and and we're talking about real political disruptions that had to do with real resistance in the period of decolonial, of anti-colonial struggle and the decolonization of the world. This period, that was subsidized and armed by the communist powers. Created real disruptions, and the Wall Street learned that, how to make money flow in from here, what happened when these things happened, and then they learned to create those beneficial effects that at the time, when they're first seeing them, are just upsides of a general challenge that they're facing. They learned to create them without the challenge, and to fake it. They learned to, but it was a long time. The markets, the money markets, the forex markets, derivatives markets are enormous. It's just huge. It's an immense amount of money. But, so it took a very long time to amass a control of a large enough percentage of this conspiratorially to manipulate it, to not really always be at its mercy. But in the early stages, they could, they started to develop their risk analysis that was very valuable and very good, where they could take some gambles knowing they would lose some of them. This is 15 minutes, so I'm going to pause it and go to the next.